Hello, I'm Robert Halsby, and welcome to this video tutorial which you're viewing on ae.tutsplus.com. In this tutorial we'll be looking at how to make a simple particle system using trapcode particular to generate particles which we can use in a variety of situations. Here are a couple of examples of where we can use what we're about to learn. So there you can see a couple of examples. We have the blood bleeding from the text here, and we have water vapour condensing on a steamed up surface such as a mirror or a piece of glass here, and another one with blood dripping down a lens. And these can all be changed and swapped together to make different effects. But without getting too bogged down in the context, let's have a look at how the basic setup is created inside After Effects. Okay, so now we're here in After Effects. The first thing we need to do is to make a new composition. We'll call this main. Now for this composition I'm going to use standard high definition 1280 by 720, 30 frames a second and about 10 seconds long. But you can change this depending on your project. And for now we can just leave that blank. We'll make another composition, we'll call this particle generation. We'll leave that with the same settings as the previous composition. Now for this example I'm going to be using text as the emitter, so I will now type my text. And for that we'll use the word particle. I'll place that roughly around the middle, it doesn't have to be exact. Finally, one more composition, we'll call this particle streaks. And into that we can put the particle generation comp, and we'll just hide that for now. Okay, so now we just need to make a new black solid. It can be any colour, but black's nice. And we'll add trapcode particular to it. Okay, so now that we have trapcode particular loaded onto the black solid, we can begin to change some of the settings. We'll open up the emitter tab and we'll change the emitter type from point to a layer. We'll go down here to the layer emitter, and we'll change that. First of all, we need to change the particle generation comp to a 3D layer. And we'll change the layer over here to particle generation. And now if I go through it, you can see the particles are actually coming out of the word particle. So now we'll just change a few more settings. We'll change the layer sampling to particle birth time and the layer RGB usage to none. That way, if you decide to make the particle generation title fancy or stylized, it won't affect the particle color. Next, we need to change the particles per second to about 30, just so it doesn't end up getting too busy in here. And we'll change the direction from uniform to directional, which by standard seems to be away from the camera, so we'll just rotate this, the X rotation, by 90 degrees, and you'll see that the particles start to fall downwards. So that's all we need to do for the emitter settings, so we can close that for now. We'll open up the particle settings. And first of all we'll change the particle life to 10 seconds, or the length of the composition. And we'll change the size from 5 to 0 so we can't see them anymore. But now I'll just enable the particle generation so we've still got something on the screen to look at. And that's all we need to do for the particles, so we can now close that. We'll open up the physics tab next. We'll put the gravity to about 70. And we'll go into the air rollout here. I'll put the air resistance to about 0.3. Now we'll go down to the turbulent field here, because we want to add some random movement, and we can affect the position by about 70 points. And down here we can change the scale to about 3, so it affects it on a smaller level, and the complexity up to 10, so there's more detail in there. Now we need to go down to the auxiliary systems, and this is where the effect starts to take shape. We'll change the emit to continuously, or if you're using an older version of particular, it should just be to on. We'll up the number of particles per second to about 100, so we get a nice smooth continuous line. And we'll change the size to about 30 for now, and the life to about 10, or the same length of your composition. And you can see that the effect is taking shape now. So at the moment these particles look a bit too big to be blood or whatever effect you choose. So what we'll do is we'll go to the size over life tab, and we'll start them off about just under halfway down. We'll have them gradually grow a bit bigger as they age, and that gives the impression that the blood is oozing out and it's spreading and being absorbed by whatever surface it's bleeding onto. And now all that's left to do is change the colour from main percentage to 100%. And now all the particles are white. Now essentially, if we hide the particle generation comp for just a second, this is the blood. We'll be using this to form a mask or a track matte for another layer. This can of course be used individually. You can just add a colour to it by effect, generate fill, and you can change that to whatever colour you like. Of course you can change it in the particle setting itself, but this is a little bit better. But we'll get into that as we get to it. So now what we need to do is we need to go back to the main composition. As you can see here, I already have a texture loaded which I can drag right in. I'll just scale that down a bit and just position it about there. And now we can drag in the particle streaks composition. That gives our particles onto the screen. Now what we can do here is we can do two different methods. We can either colorize the particles themselves or use an adjustment layer, but for the purpose of this example I'm just going to colorize the particles for now. So we'll go to generate, fill, and we'll choose a dark red color, which we can set this to overlay, which it looks decent. There are different blending modes you can experiment with, like color burn, a bit too strong, classic color burn, and then we can just reduce the opacity. It looks a little bit better. Now what I like to do is I like to add the roughen edges. It just breaks it up a bit, makes it look a bit more natural. So I'll go to Effect, Stylize, Roughen Edges. We'll take the border down to about 1 and the edge sharpness down to about 0.5. You can see the difference that makes. It breaks it up a bit, and we'll get rid of the edge sharpness altogether. Maybe increase the border a little bit more. You can see it just makes it look a bit more natural. It gives it a bit of a more grungy look. Now that looks great. We can re-add the particle generation comp on top of that, so you can see just where the blood is coming from. And you can of course enable the particle generation layer in the particle streaks comp, so when you come back over here, that is also made from the same blood, which bleeds, which looks nice, and it fulfills the purpose of this tutorial, I suppose. Now of course that is just one of the ways that this tutorial can give you results. And now let's have a look at some of the other ones, some of the more interesting ones. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll just get rid of this particle generation. We'll get rid of the fill and the roughen edges here, just so it's all back to normal. We'll set this to normal again. Full opacity. Everything's back to normal. Now I'll import a picture I took on a recent vacation to London, which is very nice. Scale this down again. A little bit higher. Now for this example we will actually use the mask I was talking about just a moment ago. So go to New Adjustment Layer, and onto this, I'll hide that for a second. Onto this we can add Blur Sharpen and Box Blur, just for speed purposes. Normally you would add Lens Blur, which gives you much more realistic results. We'll set this to about 6, and then we'll go to Effect, Color Correction, Levels. We'll move the black down so the whites kind of reduce the contrast a bit, make it look a bit steamed up. That looks about right. We can go back to the particle streak layer. We'll put this above the adjustment layer, And then we'll set the track matte over here to the inverted alpha matte of the particle streaks. You can move these about, make sure they're in a nice place. And that essentially is the effect of steam on a mirror, which looks quite good. And it also has the added benefit of not having to animate the drips by hand. It does it all for you with a simple mask. Now another example I showed you was making the blood come down the lens of the camera, which is probably one of the more practical uses for this tutorial. So I'll show you how I did that in just a second. We'll go back to here, we'll get rid of this adjustment layer altogether. We'll enable the particle streaks layer again. What we need to do is we need to add a blur to this. So we go blur sharpen, box blur. Put this up to about 8, not 78, 8. And then we can just increase the scale to about 450. Well, let's place this more or less on top. Then we'll go to Effect, Generate Fill, and we'll make this a deepish red. We can go to the, we'll duplicate this now, not the effect. We'll duplicate the layer. We'll set the first one to normal, the second one to overlay, but we will reduce the opacity of this layer here to about 10 or 20%, go 15, nice in the middle, and there you can see we have the blood dripping down. As well as this, we can also add a new adjustment layer. We can add the same box blur as we have done, make that about 5. We can duplicate again the particle streaks. We'll set those streaks as a track matte for the adjustment layer of alpha, not inverted this time, just alpha, and that way the blood also distorts the focal properties of the lens as well. It just gives it a bit more depth, makes it look a bit more realistic. Another possibility for the blood dripping down the lens is of course a customized James Bond introduction, which I haven't actually got round to making, but I'm sure that would be quite easy now that you know how to make the blood. And of course the great thing about having all these compositions is that everything can be changed and it all updates in the main composition. For example, I will now change the number of particles per second to about 100, quite intense, lots of blood, and we'll go back to the main comp here, and now we have a considerable amount of blood on the lens compared to the earlier video. Let's give that a preview. Maybe up the opacity of the normal one for now, just to give it a bit more depth. We'll make that darker as well. Now this is great when you have someone being shot in front of the camera and a blood splat on the lens isn't just good enough. You're not going to cut it, you need some movement, you want it to look a little bit more realistic, and this is a great way to do it. So there we are, that's more or less it. I hope I've managed to show you a good few ways of how to use this tutorial in your projects. And I hope that I haven't been too irritating to listen to. I'm certainly not looking forward to watching this back. However, I hope that you've enjoyed this tutorial, and most of all I hope that you've actually learned something. So thank you very much for watching. If you do have any questions, you can of course contact me via the comment section on aetutsplus.com. You can contact me by my email address, which is on screen now, or contact me on Twitter. So thanks very much for watching.